All right, so this video is going to be about how to set up your lower shock mounts when you're running both coilovers and bypasses on beams. So this is for my Bronco, and I have 12-inch coilover and 12-inch bypass. And I'm going to go over 3 things that you want to really keep in mind when you're setting this up. The first one being your ride height needs to be at least as tall as the back for obvious reasons. The second one is how to optimize your travel by bringing those shocks close inboard as you can and allowing that beam to swing as much as possible. And then the third one is how to set your shock shaft exposure when you're at ride height. So you really want them in the middle, at least for this case. I know guys that are racing, they have their setup a little bit different, but for pre-running and for this kind of thing, I want mine in the middle, so I have equal amount that can go up and down. First thing to do is take some measurements and make some calculations about what we can expect with how much each shock can travel. Now we start from the back. First step is to take the measurement of the tire from the ground to this corner, and then take the measurement from this corner to the fender. That's going to give us the measurements we need to set up the front and set our ride height. So I'm going to go on the iPad and show you guys all the measurements and go from there. All right, so this is my sketch of what I got going on. You can see here the measurement of the rear tire was 31 inches, and then the measurement from the top of the tire to the fender was 9 inches. So from that, we can find the radius of the tire is 15.5, and then add that to 9, because we're taking the measurement from this point up to the fender, and that gives us 24.5. Now, because the axle is right in the middle of the spindle, I can't get a good measurement from the center, so I need to take the measurement from the top of the spindle. So to make that adjustment, you take the diameter of the spindle, divide that by 2, and so the diameter is 1.5, and then that gives us 0.75. So deduct 0.75 from 24.5, and that gives us 23.75. Now, something I need to keep in mind is the Bronco right now is sitting on jack stands on the frame. So all of the weight of the truck is on the rear end. Whenever I put the coilovers in and the Bronco's resting on the coilovers, that's going to take a little bit of the load off of the rear. So that's going to raise the distance up just a little bit. So to account for that, I'm going to add 1 inch to those measurements. 1 inch to 9 over here brings this measurement up from 23.75 to 24.75. So that's going to be the new measurement from the spindle to the fender. All right, so this is going to be the ride height for the beam. So we can see hooked the tape measure in the spindle, measuring up to the fender, we are right at 24.75. So the next step is to position the shocks. Now, this is the most important part because these shocks need to be in the center of their travel when this is at ride height. So when this is right where it is right now, these need to be in the center. Now, there is a difference between how much these two travel because one is at a further arc length away from the radius arm pivot than this one. So we're gonna go over back to the iPad and I will show you how I calculated that amount. But before we do that, I took a measurement from this bracket with them in place and then this bracket, and that gives me 7.5 inches. So I'm going to use that to do my calculations. All right, so this is my sketch of the radius arm. This is the side profile of the beam. These are the two brackets, and here's the 7 3/4. I said 7.5, but that's what the distance between here is roughly. Now, it doesn't need to be too exact because the changes in these locations are not going to change how much that shock travels too much. For what I'm doing, it'll be fine to just get a close estimate. I set up 2 distances for the inside radius, which is the coilover, and then the outside radius, which is the shock, and then make a couple triangles out of that. So we know that the front shock travels 12 inches, so splitting that up, that's 6. And then we find that angle using trig. I won't bore you guys with all of the calculations, but that gives us this length right here. Sorry. that length ended up being 4.9. And when you double that, that gives you 9.9697-ish. So that tells us that when that arc travels, the front shock is going to travel 12 inches, and then the rear shock, which is the coilover, is going to travel 10. So you lose about 2 inches just because they're spaced that far apart. Now, another thing to consider is the spring retainer and the bump pad. I'll show you in a minute, but when those are placed on the shock, you lose about an inch because of the gap of the thicknesses of these two parts. So in reality, that 12-inch coilover really sees about 11 inches of travel because those are in the way. That's fine because this coilover is not going to travel the same distance as the shock. So the fact that you lose an inch doesn't really matter as long as you are within that 1 more inch that you have. So the important thing to know is don't let the coilover limit the travel of the beam. It has to be the front shock because that's the one that's traveling the most distance. So we'll go back out to the Bronco and start getting the location set for the coilover and the shock. All right, here you can see what I was talking about. So the spring retainer and the bump pad makes up about 7/8 of an inch, a little bit more, almost an inch. That little gap there, you'll see us have a little bit of extra space on full droop, but that is why this shock only travels 11 inches and this one travels 12. And that is also why it's very important when you're doing a dual rate setup like this, especially with radius arms and twin traction beams. The coilover needs to be in the back because the coilover, unless you have a longer one, the coilover travels less than just a regular shock. So if you had these reversed, then the front shock would only travel 11 inches and then the rear one would travel 2 less, so about 9. So with this setup, this front shock is going to be what limits our travel, and then this rear one is going to be within that 12 inches. So we're not going to have a problem. That'll give us the most travel we can possibly get with this setup. All right, now that we have the distances calculated, we got to set up what position these shocks need to be at. So this one is going to be traveling 12 inches. So this midpoint is going to be 6. So at ride height, this shaft exposure needs to be 6 inches. Now that we found out this one is 11, we need to take the measurement with the spring retainer in here. Whoops, the other way. If I can do this one-handed. All right. We need to measure the midpoint between this pad and this shock. So that's going to be about 11 inches. So this one is going to have 5.5 between this distance, and this one is going to be 6 inches at ride height. Additionally, we need to have this shock swing as close inboard as possible, because the closer this is to the inboard of the truck, the more this beam is able to swing. If this was out here, then you'd have to raise the beam because the bracket would be lower. So we need to try and squeeze out every bit of distance we can and get this as close as possible to the radius arm. That way we see the most travel during articulation. All right, so you can see here I have the tabs bolted to the coilover, and this is where we're going to set the location as close inboard as it can and make sure that that coil spring does not come into contact with the radius arm. And we're gonna give it about a little over 1/4 of an inch because this slides, and at full bump, when you're hitting impacts and stuff, this spring might flex and could hit that. So I'm gonna give it enough room to get clear, and then that is going to be our location for the lower mount. I'm gonna mark that with Sharpie, bring it back up to ride height, and then ensure these are straight, and that'll be set. All right, with the beam at 24 3/4 from the fender, we have the bypass at 6 inches, and the coilover is at 5.5. All I have to do now is make sure this bracket is behind the Sharpie line that I marked when it was at bump, and that'll ensure the coil spring does not contact the radius arm. Okay, another thing is when I am setting up this bracket, I need to make sure that these tabs are parallel with the shaft, because as this beam articulates up and down, the angle of these tabs changes. It swings with it. So if I weld this in at the wrong angle, say like this, and then this swings down, these tabs are gonna swing with the beam, and then these are gonna wanna swing against the shaft. So by setting it parallel at ride height, it will travel this way at bump and then this way at droop, and it'll keep things from binding. So at this point, we want to make sure this is perfectly parallel when we tack it in. Then make sure it's on this side of that Sharpie line. Then we should be set. That should set everything up to where nothing binds and we get the most travel possible. All right, so now that we got the lower mount tacked in, now it's time to test it. So if my math is correct, this shock should bump all the way up, and this one should still have about 1/4 of an inch gap. All right, you can see this is fully bumped and there's no space there. And you take a look at the coilover, and there's about a 1/4 of an inch gap still. So this isn't even touching at full bump, which is perfect. All right, here we have it drooped out. You can see that the bypass is right at 12 inches. And then this is gonna be difficult to measure, but let's see if I can get that in there. This is right around 10 and a little over 10.5. So this is perfect. That means that this is locking out at full bump or at full droop, and then this is bumping at full bump. This one is not bumping, and this one is not even all the way extended. So this is the ideal setup. That means that this coilover is not getting in the way at all, and everything is limited by the front, which is how it should be, because that one is traveling a longer arc length. So that's pretty much it. Worked out perfect. All right, so that pretty much wraps this video up. We got the passenger side exactly where we want it. Now it's just time to carry it over to the other side and do the exact same thing. Just to reiterate, I've never done this before. I don't have any experience, so I'm sure there's better ways to do it out there. I'm sure all of this math and the calculations are completely unnecessary. It's just something that I like to do. If you guys do have like better ideas or tips, feel free to leave them in the comments, and thanks for watching.